denigrating a man, being like, oh, you're an emotional idiot, you're not good at dating, you're not good at relationships. We need to look at the reason for that. There's a systemic cause. It's like they are losing out from that. This is a system that is hurting them as much as it's hurting women. It's suppressing their emotions. So in a way, we can call it privilege, but in a way, it's like the opposite of privilege. It's a kind of specific kind of oppression.
Welcome to Good Citizen, a podcast from the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. I'm Ted Roosevelt. Today's guest is Ruth Whippman. She's the author of BoyMom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. It's a revealing account of the challenges facing modern boys that's both rigorously researched and deeply personal. She's the mother of 3 boys, and her work cuts to the heart of a contradiction. We criticize men for their emotional limitations, yet we've built a culture that leaves them no other clear path. In our conversation, Ruth shows how girls are offered the tools for self-expression, while boys, often shamed for not being masculine enough, and they grow up feeling isolated, angry, and often pulled towards more troubling new paths. Her book provides an urgent exploration of these issues, and I hope this discussion takes a timely step towards addressing them.
I think there is something in us that strives for happiness. I think there is something natural that we all hold, which is this kind of hope that we will be happy. And it's really hard to know how much of that is cultural and how much of that is innate and all the rest of it. So when I was writing my first book, America the Anxious, we just moved from the UK to the US. And I noticed that there was this huge cultural focus on happiness. This idea that happiness was this kind of goal that you could strive for. And I think that what ended up happening is that happiness becomes this very sort of individual project. This idea that the more you focus on optimizing the self, the happier you will become. But that actually is in contradiction to all of the research and everything we know about what actually produces happiness, which is community, relationships, and focus on other people. So it's kind of becomes counterproductive, I think.
Given the mountains of research that say that, why do you think, I'll just stick with Americans for the time being, why do you think they overlook that as a source of happiness?
I think there's this idea about individual striving, that if we strive as individuals, we can succeed. There's something that's sort of primed in American culture for that kind of individualism. Sometimes that very individualistic culture can be very isolating for people. And now we live in a world which is so heavily dominated by devices, by tech, by phones, etc., that it's easy to become extremely isolated.
Building on this idea of cultural influences and social systemic priorities, I'm thinking of your work on raising 3 boys today, and I'm wondering how you see gender influencing what we prioritize as a society.
I am a mom of 3 boys. So obviously I'm a woman. I was socialized as a girl. And then I found myself with these 3 boys. And I was sort of really surprised by some things in kind of male culture. These are general trends. But in general, when we socialize girls, we kind of prioritize relationships and emotions and sort of social interaction, things like friendship, things like cooperation. And when we socialize boys, we tend to prioritize things like being tough, being strong, competition, winning. We sort of frame social interaction for boys and men as more of a kind of competitive, oppositional thing. I noticed it a lot in terms of the books and stories and TV shows say, my boys will get fed through all the algorithms and all the libraries and all of the branding, compared with our neighbors who have 3 girls. All of the girls' books seem to be about friendship, about relationship dilemmas, about meeting other people's needs, about being in community, those kinds of stories. And pretty much every story that my boys get fed tends to be a battle. There's a winner, there's a loser, there's a hero, there's a villain, a glorious hero, and somebody gets killed. That is what the interaction consists of. So I think these end up promoting really quite different values to men and women about what's important, what human interaction should look like.
In your telling of that, it sounds like the unlock for you to kind of recognize that the different lessons based on the genders was really when you became a mother and when you had 3 boys.
Yeah.
The contrast became particularly stark to you.
I think that's absolutely right, because I think I just wasn't really immersed in the culture of boyhood. I remember this sort of one moment, which was I was in the bookstore with my 3 boys who were really quite little at the time. They were kind of causing havoc. And I saw this magazine. We were in the kids section, and I saw this magazine that was like very, very heavily coded towards girls, young girls. It had like a pink sparkly cover and this like friendship bracelet giveaway and all these stories about friendship. Anyway, so I opened the magazine and I looked inside, and the first story was this story about this girl who had been invited to 2 birthday parties that were happening at the same time. And she was really stressed that she was going to like let down or disappoint one of the friends by not going to her party. So she concocts this whole ruse where she's going to like run between the 2 parties, pretend to be at both. And as I was reading this, firstly, I was thinking, oh my God, I relate to this so much, this kind of emotional labor that's involved in all of this. And I was also thinking, my boys will never see a story like this with a boy character. They will never be asked to kind of track what other people are feeling in that way, or sort of prioritize friendships in that way, or kind of do that kind of relational work. In a way, it's kind of burdensome for the girls involved, and maybe they're thinking about it too much, and there's too much of that kind of burden on women. But then I was thinking, actually, my boys are really losing out. Like, these are essential skills of human connection, of friendship, of thinking about somebody else's needs. And they're not learning that in the same way as a girl of the same age.
Do you have thoughts about why that is? Why do we have these different lessons for the genders?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And I think it's complex. I think there's lots of things. I think that probably if I talk to somebody in book publishing or in movie making or whatever, they'd probably just say, well, boys don't want that. Boys aren't interested in that stuff. They just want adventure stories. And if we produce something like that, it won't sell. But I actually kind of disagree with that. I don't think that's true. I think partly they've just never had it. So it becomes self-perpetuating. So they don't really know how to write that kind of story in a way that feels true and authentic and appeals to boys. I think we have this idea that like relationships and nurturing and empathy are kind of feminine coded traits. And we have this idea that like winning and succeeding and fighting and toughness are masculine coded traits, and that we kind of just keep telling that same story over and over. And I think there's another piece to it, which is that in our society, generally, we tend to devalue things that are associated with girls and women. You know, it's a sexist society. So things that women like generally don't have as much cultural value as things that men like. And so therefore, when we try to introduce girls to kind of traditionally boy things, it feels like empowerment or like a promotion. Whereas when we try to introduce boys to more like feminine coded things, it feels like a bit of an embarrassment. A lot of it is to do with industrialization and the kinds of work that we expected men and women to take on, specialization, all the rest of it. It's to do with power. I think it's to do with physical strength. This idea that being like a girl or like a woman is somehow embarrassing or emasculating.
Yeah.
And it's a setup. So all of the things, you know, that are so essential for like a psychologically healthy life are somehow like gay or girly. And actually it's really to the detriment of men. And I think we just sort of shower them in shame. And it's a really, really hard thing to let go of.
There's no question that being a parent is an eye-opening experience in a lot of ways. And I did read about you trying to have sort of approach parenthood sort of in a more gender-neutral way initially. And we did the same thing where I was like, we don't care.
right.
Everything's going to be yellow. Yeah. It's all going to be like chill. And then we have a boy and 2 girls, and like, there was a distinction. I mean, I'm not saying there's always a distinction, but there did seem to be something that was causing them to pick lanes.
For sure. I mean, I interviewed this woman, Juliet Williams, who's a professor at UCLA in gender studies. And she said to me this thing which rang really true, which is like parenting turns everybody into a gender essentialist, because we're all like, oh, this doesn't matter. You know, I ain't going to do it differently. And it's not just us, it's the world as well that's socializing them in certain ways. And there's elements of nature and it all interacts with each other. But gender's a powerful thing. It means a lot to people. And I think we shouldn't deny that. There is so much research about the way that people parent boys and girls differently in subconscious ways that they don't even know they're doing it. But we sort of teach boys in so many little ways to suppress their emotions. Even the parents who are not saying, and I think probably nowadays it's hard to imagine many liberal parents being like, man up, you sissy. I don't think many people...
But that is a message. That is a message that they're hearing from other sources now.
Right. And they're probably hearing it from us in more subtle ways that we're just not really aware of. And I think it's really true. I interviewed all kinds of boys across America, different backgrounds, different political opinions, different geographic locations. And they all said the same thing about this. And they said we were allowed to be angry and we were allowed to be happy. And everything else was very complicated to access. And people were not comfortable with sadness. They were not comfortable with emotional expression in more complex ways from them as boys.
Do you know the movie Meet the Parents?
Yeah.
Remember that movie with Ben Stiller?
Yeah, I haven't seen it in a long time.
And I hadn't seen it in a long time, but as I sort of like bring movies up for my kids now, I'm like, oh, this is a funny movie. You guys might enjoy it. And I realized that the sort of butt of the joke throughout the movie was that the Ben Stiller character is a male nurse. And that is so ridiculous a premise that everybody can laugh at Ben Stiller, the male nurse, because he's not a doctor. And that was like a hugely successful movie that nobody...
And nobody questions it.
Ha-ha.
It just, oh God, that's
and nobody
so
questions
fascinating. Well, you know what? I was thinking a sort of related thing. I took my kids to see the Inside Out movies. I don't know if you saw those.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
and so like... Inside Out 1, there's Inside Out 2, and then there's a bunch of shorts. And like, there's these like deeply complex stories about a girl's like emotions and her relationship with her mother, and her mother has complex emotions, and they track each other's emotions. She tracks her friends' emotions. And every single time a male character appears on the screen, he's like this emotional idiot. And you like go into like the dad's head, all the emotions of their like feet up and they're like drinking beer and watching the game, and they're like, And it's like mocking him. But you're just like, what are we saying here to these young kids? We're saying everybody has a complex emotional life apart from you. And this came out last year. We just give it a total pass. And I think had there been a sexist stereotype like that about girls in like a contemporary Disney or Pixar movie, we'd be like, no way, we're not standing for that. But we just don't have the way to call it out for boys. And I see having 3 boys, just like what an impact this is having on them, what an impact it's having on boys in general. And I think they feel extremely mocked, demeaned, ridiculed. I think it's making them turn away from feminism and all the good principles of it. And I think hate speech and bullying is hate speech and bullying, no matter who it's targeted at. And this idea that because they're a privileged group doesn't apply. And I think this also becomes really complex. If you're denigrating a man being like, oh, you're an emotional idiot, you're not good at dating, you're not good at relationships, we need to look at the reason for that. There's a systemic cause. It's like they are losing out from that. This is a system that is hurting them as much as it's hurting women. It's suppressing their emotions. So in a way, we can call it privilege, but in a way, it's like the opposite of privilege. It's a kind of specific kind of oppression. So it's really complicated.
You spent some time with kind of the extreme end of this, incels. And I'm really curious what you learned in those conversations. Like, what did you go in expecting, if you did have expectations, and sort of what did you come out with?
Yeah, it was really a fascinating experience. So I don't know if your listeners know what incels are, but it stands for involuntary celibate. And they tend to be these like very lonely guys who can't get women, who can't have sex, socially isolated, and who kind of congregate in these online forums. And there is like a lot of extremely misogynistic and hate-filled content in these forums. There's like the absolute worst, the dregs of like hate speech directed at everybody. And there's also violence. So this character that we have in our mind of this sort of lonely, awkward young guy it's a lot of sort of school shooters, a lot of mass shooters are associated with this movement. So the thing that was actually really shocking to me was that alongside all this extremely toxic, with a capital T, horrific content, was also this like really vulnerable and emotionally supportive space. So these guys, they're very lonely and they use these spaces in a way that I've never seen young men interact with each other anywhere else. So they were actually all talking about their feelings. They were all talking about their mental health. They were all supporting one another.
That's so interesting.
Which was fascinating because I'd been like looking for a place where men felt permission to do that. And I was like, the last place I expected to find it was like on an incel forum. They believe in this hierarchy of masculinity, but they believe that they've just kind of given up in ever achieving it themselves, which is very different from the rest of the manosphere, which is all about, you too can become an alpha male if you take these protein whatevers and eat only meat and whatever. So, so they have kind of given up. But there's something about giving up on this project of like being the most masculine, being an alpha male, being tough, being strong. And they're like, we're never going to succeed. So we might as well just be emotional with each other. It was really freeing for them. They saw it as a real source of emotional support and connection that they could get nowhere else in their life, which is worrying. For those of us with sons, we're like, if we don't want them to go and find belonging and connection in an incel forum, then we need to find a way for them to have it somewhere else.
What's so interesting is that they still believe in the hierarchy of alpha males, because it's a little bit of the like cage, like that's the cage that puts them in this place to some degree.
Yeah. It's so sad because they have these toxic opinions, but then you like scratch the surface, you talk to them for 5 minutes, give them a sort of empathetic ear, and like the opinions kind of melt away, honestly. And what you hear is just this like utter wellspring of pain and trauma and loss. A lot of them are people who've come from traumatic upbringings. They've often been really bullied, very, very bullied. And in a weird way, it kind of mirrors a lot of feminist discourse around masculinity, which also believes that there are hierarchies of masculinity with the like alpha males and the like hegemonic masculinity. So they're using different terms. The incels call them chads, and the masculinity feminist scholars call them hegemonic, whatever. But it's the same idea that some men are extremely successful in this system and they reap all the rewards of it, and other less masculine, less successful men are disadvantaged as a result. And so the easiest thing is to look to whoever's below them on that hierarchy, which is women, and hate them. And I think what ends up happening, especially in the culture wars, is that we all respond to everyone at face value. So somebody's saying like, I hate women and feminists are the worst. And then someone comes in to like defend why women are not the worst. And it's just like, we're actually talking to each other at the wrong level. Historically, we've given so much outsized importance to men's opinions and very little importance to their feelings. And so it's really understandable that they're going to code those feelings as opinions. All those feelings are going to come out in these toxic opinions because that's how we validate men. We listen to their opinions. We give them importance. And so I just feel like so many of these incels are feeling like they would love to leave this and get some help elsewhere, but they feel like nobody's listening, that everybody is just against them. If we could just find a way to offer help and empathy rather than shame and blame, it might be a more effective strategy.
Where do you get pushback from?
I get pushback, I think, to two sort of main types. I get it from the right and I get it from the left. So actually, I've been really surprised.
Both sides.
Both sides, right. What I would say is like fundamentally, I have had so much more support than pushback, which has been really lovely. And I've had support from men. I've had so many men be like, I've read this book, which I thought they would never do because it's called BoyMom, say they felt really seen, they felt really validated. I've had support from women, et cetera, et cetera. But where the pushback comes from, so I think there's this like, I had this like bunch of right-wing trolls who are like, you only say this because you're an ugly, disgusting feminist who can't get a real man and like, you just need to like...
Super helpful. Yeah.
That whole side of things, which almost in a way, like it's horrible and it's frightening, but it's like easier to dismiss. And then I get some pushback from the left being like, girls and women are struggling so much in our current moment. Why are we diverting resources to thinking about boys and men? You're not a good feminist somehow if you're not joining in the kind of bashing of men and boys. It's like a false equivalence that you're promoting.
How do you respond to that? I mean, not forget the vile comments because those aren't worth responding to.
Yeah.
But how do you respond to the more nuanced comments?
Firstly, I think we need to let go of this zero-sum thinking. We can care about more than one thing at once. We can care about both women and girls and men and boys. But I think that it's actually these two things are related. Helping men and boys is helping women and girls. Dealing with these toxic behaviors and the root causes of them and the pain and the unhealthy models and the rigid norms and everything that are like driving these behaviors will ultimately make a generation of healthier, more emotionally attuned men who will then become better partners and brothers and bosses and workers and whatever to the women in their lives. Having a generation of healthier men is beneficial for everybody. And so these things are not in competition with each other, and they shouldn't be. We're all part of this system together. And so much work of feminism has promoted that. We know that patriarchy harms men and women. There's a great tradition of feminist thought. And I think it's only recently in our kind of online echo chambers that we've started to see it quite as much of a competition as we have. And so I think it's about challenging the system rather than the people in it.
I wonder if you feel like there are traits and virtues associated with the genders that get lost as we kind of dismantle the gender structure that we have in place that are virtuous and good.
Yeah, I think this is a really complicated thing. And weirdly, every time I talk about this is the thing that gets me the most pushback. Yes, of course, there are things associated with masculinity that are extremely positive. Courage, strength, self-sacrifice, bravery, etc., etc. And even things like ambition or agency, all of those things are like wonderful qualities and hugely important. I don't think they're associated just with men. I don't think that just men hold those. And similarly with femininity, empathy, nurturing, caregiving, etc., all humans need all of these things. Like we all need to be courageous and strong and brave and whatever when it calls for it. And we all need to be empathetic and nurturing and in touch with our emotions. And so I don't think we should be giving these universal human qualities a gender.
So that's an excellent setup for the next question, which is like we've identified the problem.
Right.
What can we do here? I mean, what are the steps forward?
Depending on whether you're talking from a policy standpoint or in our parenting or in our own homes. But I think one, to sort of start from a standpoint of empathy and listening and understanding rather than blame and shame and ridicule. I think we need to look at the way that we socialize boys and really how we're failing them as a society. There's a sort of mass emotional neglect of young boys at some level in the sense that we're not providing them with the same opportunities to feel their feelings, to express their feelings. We're not giving their feelings the same value. We're kind of under-nurturing them in that specific way. In the book, BoyMom, I talk about boyhood is like a weird mix of indulgence and neglect. So there is this sense that boys do get indulged and their bad behavior gets indulged and all the rest of it, but their emotions get neglected. So we need to look at both sides of that. And there are multiple ways to do that in terms of validating boys' feelings, correcting for that, talking to them about their emotions, showing them content with boys in emotional and relational roles, like books, movies, TV shows. And at a policy level, in the same way that we've funded so many programs to kind of get girls interested in STEM subjects or like close the gap in math or whatever, I think we need to see these like relational things as important and fund initiatives that will help boys in these domains.
Ruth, I'm curious what you would say to somebody who heard your response about leading with empathy and which I totally agree with, but that is a very hard thing to ask of people in the face of all the sort of toxic messaging that they're spewing out. Like, why is it on the listener to the toxic stuff to lead with empathy?
It's a really, really good question. And this is, I think, a tricky one. So look, I am not saying that a survivor of sexual assault, for example, should be leading with empathy towards her. This is not the point. There are certain people who can lead this and certain people who can't lead this and certain people who've been harmed. But I think at a policy level, I think we need to see this. I think we should all be talking more in terms of like a systemic failure that is harming everybody. And we're all trapped in a rotten system together, which is causing some toxic things. It's causing harm to men. It's causing harm to women and people of all genders. Rather than saying this is like men bad, women good, I think it's about a kind of intellectual reframe on it. And I think part of being progressive is to look at systemic roots of problems rather than to blame individual people for their circumstances.
Right.
And I think we need to do that as much with men and boys as we do with any other group. This generation has had a really unique and extremely difficult experience of coming of age in the shadow of this whole conversation about toxic masculinity. They're moving very sharply to the right. They're resentful, they're angry, they're failing to launch, they're doing poorly at school, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a combination of factors, that's leading to this. So yes, I think it's getting better and it's getting worse. I think this generation had the worst of it, maybe. I'm hoping they didn't get so much of the newer, let's listen to men's problems, let's work on this, let's find ways for them to be more emotionally healthy. They had all the old problems and then they got all the new problems as well.
I totally agree. And in my own experience, when I spent some time working on kind of expanding my emotional range, one of the experiences I had was if I become more in touch with my emotions, I had this fear that I was going to lose my resilience.
Right.
And in reality, the inverse happened. The expansion of the emotional actually made me much more resilient, that I was actually quite fragile because it triggered into anger so quickly, or it triggered into sort of more toxic responses.
It's so true. I think that's such an important framing. And I think we see this in the way that people understand violence, or domestic violence, or things like school shootings. It's not masculinity that makes men violent. It's this kind of shame about not feeling masculine enough, that they're not living up to this ideal of this extremely invincible, bulletproof, tough man. And the shame makes them do these violent things to kind of compensate. And actually, if we give people access to a healthier emotional range, then it does build resilience, in kids and in adults too.
I do have one final question, which is the one we ask everybody, which is a little bit of a non sequitur, but I actually think is deeply rooted in the conversation. And that is, what makes a good citizen?
Oh, that's so fascinating. I think curiosity, openness, empathy, community building, and the willingness to engage with opposing arguments in a respectful way.
Wonderful lessons. Absolutely agree. Ruth, thank you very much. I really appreciated this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's been such a pleasure.
Ruth, this is such an important conversation, and I really appreciate the work you're doing and the time you took to speak with me today. It's such a critical moment in time, and I think just having these conversations helps begin to give our boys the support they need, which ultimately I think serves everyone. So thank you again. Listeners, I urge you all, women and men, mothers and fathers alike, to pick up a copy of BoyMom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. And if you haven't yet, please also check out my interview with Tony Porter. It's a further exploration into masculinity, the socialization of men and boys, and the strength found in vulnerability. Good Citizen is produced by the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library in collaboration with the Future of Storytelling and Charts and Leisure. You can learn more about TR's upcoming library at trlibrary.com.